The novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald once made a very astute observation about our human tendency. He said, "Growing up is an exceedingly hard thing to do. It is easier to skip it and go from one childhood to another." The minute I read those words, I thought of this story that constitutes our gospel lesson of the morning, because I cannot think of a better way to describe the behavior of the younger son in this, the most famous parable that Jesus ever told. As we just heard it read, it begins with a young man who is adult in body, but in heart and spirit, very much a self-centered, egotistical child. I base this on the first thing that he does in the story. That is, he walks in one day and says to his father, "Give me now my share of the inheritance." Did he have any inkling of the implications of that request, what it would do to the family business, or how it would affect the feelings of the one to whom he spoke? I do not know, but I know that it was a radical assertion. For example, the inheritance laws of that era meant the younger son was entitled to a third of his father's assets. Now, you don't have to be a genius to know that if you withdraw that big a percentage of the capital in any business, be it a farm or whatever, you're going to cripple the enterprise. But that doesn't seem to be a concern to this lad. At a more personal level, these words convey an incredible kind of hard-heartedness. You realize, do you not, that what he was really saying to his father was, "I wish you were dead. I wish we'd had your funeral yesterday, so today we could be about the business of dividing up your property. It's what you have, not what you are, that I really care about. If I could just get my hands on your stuff, then I would be through with you for the rest of my life." Now, I suppose there have been moments when some parents have at least had the suspicion that this is the way their children felt, but only rarely is somebody as crass and is open about it. The point is that here we have the epitome of an egocentric, self-centered, very childlike spirit. Here is a man who seems to live in a house of mirrors. That is, he is bounded north, south, east, and west simply by self-concern and great insensitivity and indifference to everything else. He is the tyrant in the high chair, even though his body had reached adult proportions. So here we have, in effect, a man-child, one who has big body but little heart and spirit. It's interesting that his father complies with this brash request. I'll come back in a moment to say why I think he did that. He took 1/3 of everything that he had made and saved and handed it over to the young man, and he lost little time in converting it into cash and heading out for a place that Jesus simply calls a distant country. And there, not surprisingly, he ran head-on into a world he had neither created nor did he understand. I've spoken before of how Paul Tillich used to say that reality is what we come up against, a reality of those things to which we have to adjust when we discover they will not adjust to us. You see, we're not alone. We're not the only entities on the stage of history. There are structures and people out there that have a life of their own, a kind of stubborn otherness. This world is not a bowl of Jell-O into which we stick our hands and do whatever we will with it. There are entities out there that have a life of their own, and this young man collided head-on in his willfulness with things that could not care about his own wishful fantasy. And so it was, in a very short amount of time, what his father had been smart enough to make and save, he was dumb enough to lose and to waste. And when he'd run through his inheritance, a famine comes, and the only way he manages to survive is to hire himself out to a pig farmer in that particular country. Now, this was a fall of titanic proportions. Here is the son of a prosperous gentleman Jewish farmer, reduced to having to take care of the animals that the Jewish people most abhorred. And when he asked his new boss, "Where do I eat?" he pointed to the trough and said, "As you slop the hogs, you can have some of what they have to eat." It was an incredibly humiliating moment. A moment when suddenly his whole life came crashing before him. It's a significant rite of passage in everybody's journey. When you get to those times that you realize that it's too late to worry about innocence, when you have publicly and visibly failed and you can no longer deny it. And it had its impact on the young man. Jesus said that there in the pig pen, with all his bridges under the water, with all the water under the bridge, he began to come to himself. In the original Greek, that's a medical term for waking up from a coma or beginning to come to after you have fainted. It's those moments when you begin to see reality more clearly and recognize the shape of things outside yourself. And in that moment, the young man began to see his own pretentiousness, his own arrogance. He began to realize what he'd done to his father, to his family, yea, to the whole of creation. It was one of those creative windows of opportunity. He began to come to himself. But then, lo and behold, the very thing that F. Scott Fitzgerald warned about takes place in this lad's life. Instead of using this moment to begin to grow up, he proceeds to try to move from one form of childhood to another. And what he proposed was that he would go back home and make a clean breast, admit to his father how foolish he had been, but then he would ask his father to take him back as one of his hired hands. In other words, let him become dependent again on somebody else, live out on the edge of things, and let somebody else tell him when to get up and when to go to bed. Somebody else make all his provisions for him. Psychologically, he wanted to regress back to infancy. He wanted to re-enter the womb. He wanted to become a baby again so that in that condition somebody else would take care of him. Now, admittedly, this is a very different kind of childishness than he had manifested at the first of the story. At that point, he wanted total freedom. This was the infantilism of wanting to be grandiose and have no limits whatsoever. But now he goes to the opposite extreme, and he doesn't want any freedom at all. He wants to become a baby again and let everybody else take care of him. I would suggest to you that this swing from arrogance to infantilism is not that unusual in the wake of a great and painful failure. We saw it happen on the stage of our own national history in our own 20th century. Erich Fromm tried to figure out what had happened to the German nation, enlightened as they were, that enabled them to accept somebody as awesome as Hitler to be their Fuhrer. And then he began to realize that they had lost World War I. The treaties that had been drawn up were very detrimental to the German interest. Then they'd had a devastating economic era in the 20s. They were so humiliated and broken in self-esteem that they were right for somebody like Hitler, who came and said, "Put out your eyes and I'll do your looking for you. Stop up your ears and I'll do your listening. I will take over your life and be your total master." You see, that's exchanging the infantilism of grandiosity for the infantilism of perpetual dependency. It is a great and common temptation, and when we have tried to be more than we are and crashed painfully with reality, then we want to be less than we are. His words are right. Growing up is very difficult. It's easier to skip it and go from one childhood to another. And yet the truth is, this lad who embodies this human tendency so powerfully was interrelated to someone who wasn't willing to let that happen. And I think that here is the real saving point of the story. We need to shift our attention now from this very, very human story to the figure of the father, who not only represents good parenting at its best on a human level, but what's so significant about this parable, the figure of the father gives us a glimpse into the very heart of God, and what comes to us is that the one who birthed us and gave us life doesn't want us to stay baby forever, God is the great facilitator of maturity. He wants us to grow into full and complete adulthood, and He has the energy and the patience and the mercy and the wisdom to make it happen. Look, if you will, for a moment at the actions of this facilitator of maturity. I think this is why, in the story, the Father gave the Son His inheritance when He did. It must have been very, very difficult for Him to have taken what He had worked so hard for and passed it over to somebody that He was clear did not have the wisdom to know how to use it. And yet the Father was wise enough to realize that the boy was at a point in his life where he was going to have to learn for himself what he refused to be taught by anybody else. Now, we humans don't have to reinvent the wheel unless we're so pig-headed and so untrusting that we refuse to learn from everybody else. But the truth is, there are many people who simply won't believe it until they have learned it through the pain of their own experience. And it's so hard for a loving parent to realize that there come times that you have to let your child go and learn through their suffering what they refuse to learn in any other way. There's something so deep in us, if we're good parents, that wants to protect our children, to keep them from suffering, and yet to do that excessively cuts them off from the very possibility of learning truths that they need to learn. Geddes McGregor has written a beautiful little book of theology called He Who Lets Us Be. His contention is that God shows His love for us as much in what He doesn't do for us as in what He does. He says that the only way a child is ever going to learn to walk is when the parent sets the child down and then steps back and lets that one have room enough to stand up and fall down, to begin by his own experience to start learning how to be autonomous. If we carry our children around in our arms forever, we keep them at a state of helplessness. And the overly protected child is often sent into the world defenseless and ill-equipped to cope with life as life is going to meet him. And so I admire the Father who stood down those instincts to protect and manifest what today is called tough love, the love that doesn't do everything for another, but knows those moments when we have to step back and let people learn what they refuse to be taught by anybody else. And I think that's why He gave him his inheritance at that point. But when he saw him coming back from the far country, and when he realized that there, in the pain of his own collisions with reality, that he had learned the crucial lesson of limits, that he was not a Superman, that he did not have absolute and total competence. When the Father saw that he had learned that crucial lesson of limits, and then the boy came limping back home wanting to be a baby again, notice carefully, he refused to accept him back on those terms. He didn't say to the servants, go get a bassinet, go get a pacifier. Thanks be to God, Junior has at last realized that Daddy knows best. Come, let me take you in my lap and let me carry you around for the rest of your life. He doesn't say that. No, he called for ring, robes, and shoes, symbols of sonship, authority, responsibility, power. He was saying to that lad, now that you have learned the lesson of your limits, now I invite you to take the strength that you do have and become a responsible member of the family enterprise. You are not a Superman, and you learned that in the far country, but neither are you a hired hand. You have strengths and abilities that the family needs for you to exercise. You are a junior partner, a very crucial participant. I invite you to grow up, which means accepting your limits, and then within your limits, taking your powers and offering them in the service of the common good. In other words, he was inviting the lad to that very difficult task of not going from one kind of childhood to another, but that difficult task of growing up, accepting limits, accepting gifts, and becoming a participant in the whole wonder of creation. Now, my friends, in one level or another, this is the story of every one of us. This is the story of how all of us started out egocentrically. We had no choice but to begin in helplessness and therefore almost total self-concern. But God doesn't want us to stay there. St. Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, thought as a child, reasoned as a child. But that's not where I was intended to remain. I was to let go those childish things in the service of growing into the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, which means to become a fully functioning adult. And therefore I find myself wondering this morning, where is the great facilitator of maturity? Where is God working with me and with you this morning? Is He working with us on that issue of limits, where we have these grandiose notions that we can do everything, where we think that we have absolutely no limits whatsoever? Maybe that's the place where the great facilitating mercy is causing us to look honestly. Or maybe the growth edge for us is in recognizing that we do have a part to play in history, that though we can't do everything, we can do something, and therefore we take our powers which are given to us and begin to use them in the service of helping other people. I don't know where the Father of maturing is working with you this morning, but this is our own story. And I remind you of those awesome words. Growing up is difficult indeed. It's easier to skip it and to go from one childhood to another. That is not the script that God wants for any of our lives. Now, the interesting thing is that we're not told in the parable how the youngest son responded to this invitation to grow up. His father shows all kinds of mercy and all kinds of compassion. God is willing to give us 1,000,000 chances, and there is mercy enough in God to cover all of our past failures. But not even God can make us grow up unless we hear the challenge and see that's what we were born to be, and then set about with God into that task of growing up and growing on. Therefore, we're not told how the younger son responded, because that was the part of the story he had to write. Just as this morning, you have to write how you're going to respond to God's great desire that you grow into maturity. The final decision is ours. There's an old story that I heard first when I was just a little child, but it's worth repeating in this moment. There was a wise old man in the community that constantly was approached by people, and the words that came from his mouth were always so reality-based. There was a brash young man, much like the fellow in our parable here, who was jealous of the old man and decided he wanted to set him up to fail so that he could somehow humiliate him. And so he devised this very simple little ploy. He decided he would take a bird just after it had been hatched, a tiny little thing, and put it in his hands and go to the old man and said, "Old man, I have a bird in my hands. Tell me, is he dead or alive?" And if the old man said he was dead, he would open up his hand and show him alive. If the old man said it was alive, he would imperceptibly squeeze it until it was dead, and then open it up, so that either way the old man answered, he was bound to be wrong. So he went in his cockiness with his bird and with his hands and said, "Old man, I have a bird in my hands. Tell me, is he dead or alive?" And the old man looked down for a long moment and then answered quietly, "The answer, my son, is in your hands." Growing up or going from one childhood to another, the answer, it's in our hands.